Story 1. I feel that since elected officials control the law, this would be a relatively easy loophole to use to eliminate people you do not agree with. Story 2. This sounds like a way to legitimately remove political opponents and rivals if bad actors collude. For better or worse, elected positions should have as few restrictions as possible to minimize how those in power can weaponize them against reform. Story 3. Such a law would be abused by corrupt politicians, of which there are many. With rampant corruption in the legal system, people are convicted of crimes they did not commit, charged with fabricated offenses, and forced to plead guilty to crimes they did not commit just to move the process along and avoid rotting in prison indefinitely. Story 4. That's the job of the voter. If you don't want felons in office, don't vote for them. Creating rules for felons means you can give anyone the status of felon to keep them out of office. We know the current administration would declare Democrats felons, try them, and remove them. Story 5. Suppose you live in a state where abortion is illegal. You have an abortion and are convicted, perhaps fined or imprisoned. Can you then be barred from running for public office? Story 6. Convicted of what? Any crime at all? Too easily exploited and weaponized. Story 7. There is no way this law would be abused by ambitious politicians and ideologically driven district attorneys in deep red or deep blue enclaves with like-minded juries to target political opponents. Story 8. The problem arises when people are convicted because of political interests. Story 9. Many people would never be elected, like Bernie Sanders, who protested in Chicago against school segregation in 1963. Story 10. It seems that if that had been a law in South Africa, the world would have missed out on the leadership of Nelson Mandela. Story 11. As president, I am now directing the Department of Justice to seek conviction against my re-election opponent. Story 12. Convicted individuals are a broad category. If you shoplift at 15, you should not be permanently barred from running for mayor. Maybe you mean felonies? I support some separation between felony convictions and holding elected office, but treating people who have been most negatively affected by the system as incapable of helping to fix it is nonsense. Story 13. I would not like it. Could cause unforeseen problems. Trump could drum up fake charges against his opponents and secure a shoddy conviction for a bad signature from 20 years ago. I also believe in redemption. Someone who broke the law at age 18 could be an amazing person at age 40. Why block them from running? Let us choose who we want. We can vote against them if we do not like the conviction. Story 14. As has been pointed out, this approach is too prone to abuse to be workable. What we need is a mechanism for recalling elected officials. We should not have to wait 3 years and 10 months to vote again once it becomes clear that someone is a trash bag. Story 15. I support removing someone from office if convicted of a crime that carries imprisonment. However, if convicted people are barred from holding any position, we effectively incentivize weaponized law enforcement. Story 16. It could be abused by a corrupt system. People in power collude to prosecute and convict political opponents. Then there is no opposition. Story 17. Seems like a great way to remove people who do not support your agenda. It is not a good idea. Convictions are public records. Leave the decision up to the voters, for better or worse. Story 18. Barring someone from running for public office because of a prior conviction is excessively punitive. Forcing an elected official to vacate office over a conviction depends on the offense and how it affects their ability to perform their duties. There is a huge difference between a conviction for jaywalking and a conviction for funneling public funds to an offshore account. Story 19. Bad idea. Someone you dislike can be falsely charged to make them ineligible. If voters do not care about a criminal conviction, there is no reason to prevent that person from being elected. Many laws are unjust. If someone was convicted for smoking marijuana or for being arrested at a protest, that should not necessarily bar them from becoming a public servant. The only conviction that could potentially be used to bar someone would be treason. Story 20. It can be used against them politically. That is why it was not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. If it is to be used as a qualifier, limit it to cases of a fraud conviction or a sex offense. Sex offenses typically require registration. Even then, one must be careful. Story 21. I believe nearly half of our government, not on party lines, would be forced to resign, and they are not going to vote themselves out. Story 22. Instead, implement checks and balances so no one can abuse the law. It does not matter what they have been through. What matters is what they do. They should not be able to upend the entire system that elected them. Story 23. I support it, but convictions need to be reasonably defined. Any felony would qualify while misdemeanors would be limited. Story 24. The right would use it against the left by characterizing their actions as criminal or charging them with mortgage fraud. Story 25. It would make it too easy to use the courts to remove your political opponents. Does no one remember Alexei Navalny? Story 26. Maybe go watch the documentary 13th, then come back here and tell us your thoughts. Story 27. I think those are two different issues, and I would not like that law in either case. Suppose an elected official must resign if convicted after being elected. I can see the logic and do not necessarily disagree. If an elected official commits a crime, they should probably not hold office. But what crimes disqualify a person? Murder, treason, and bribery are obvious. What about disorderly conduct? For example, if a representative is arrested at a protest and convicted of disturbing the peace, is that enough to disqualify them? Unless the law limits which crimes are disqualifying, it becomes a slippery slope. Regarding barring people with felony convictions from office, I am firmly against it. If someone is convicted, serves their time, and is released, should they be barred from running for office? Even a person who committed murder and later repented should not be permanently excluded. In a democracy, people who have served their sentence should be allowed to run for office. Story 28. I think someone would turn an allegation they heard into a full-fledged accusation. Trump hears things all the time. He uses his bully pulpit or Truth Social to condemn people as guilty. If it were proven and a jury convicted him, then yes. Story 29. I do not think it would be a good idea. I know many people who made mistakes when they were younger and are still struggling today because of the stigma surrounding felons. Some genuinely reform, then work their asses off to prove themselves, taking a limited range of low-paying jobs that accept felons, just to survive in the hope they earn enough to eventually afford a lawyer to get their record expunged after many years. Story 30. In a perfect world, this would be a great idea. In our world, there would be prosecutions against political enemies just to get them out of office. Story 31. First things first. Wealthy criminals make the laws, and the system favors them completely. There are even country club prisons for when they must serve a short sentence. If you have the money, you are effectively above the law to an extent, and the rest depends on who you shake hands with. Story 32. It sounds great now, but it would just be weaponized to make anyone advocating for change disappear in the future. Story 33. On its face, I'd agree. But some groups would weaponize it to take their rivals off the proverbial chessboard. Story 34. Honestly, I'd support it. If someone can't pass a background check for a normal job, they shouldn't be allowed to run a country. Story 35. No, because people do change. Perhaps a time limit after a conviction? Even then, I'm not sure. The real problem is when corrupt governments convict opponents to prevent them from being elected. Story 36. If we are talking about people who have served their sentences, they have paid their debt to society and should be allowed to have a life rather than continue to be punished. If someone holds public office and is convicted of a crime that includes jail time, they must step down to serve that time. This is not the case for the president, whose own Supreme Court has set a precedent that he essentially cannot be prosecuted or convicted while in office. Change that. Story 37. I would not support it if it were that broad. It would depend on the crimes. Redemption matters. I would vote for someone from a disadvantaged background who served time for selling drugs if that candidate campaigned on fighting poverty, funding education, and supporting youth programs to prevent drug use. People who have experienced a problem are most likely to understand its roots and offer solutions. Someone like that would defend my interests better than a billionaire. There is also a two-tier justice system, And poor people are much more likely to be barred from office than rich people. If voters do not want people with felony convictions in office, they can vote for someone else. Story 38. As a general rule, no. It would allow the authorities to take out opposing politicians with fabricated charges or allegations from decades ago. You could limit it by type of offense, for example, murder, rape, and serious fraud, and impose a time limit on the bar. That would reduce some of the issues and allow a court to lift it early. Story 39. If you are a convicted felon, you should not be able to hold public office. If a child tells the school administration that they had sex with a teacher, the teacher will be fired and barred from teaching even if there is no evidence. Yet, a political leader with an actual felony conviction can still run this country? Story 40. I would imagine that the Department of Justice would aggressively pursue frivolous convictions against Democratic politicians. Story 41. Absolutely not. It is up to voters to decide what is acceptable in a candidate. Also, using lawfare to keep certain individuals out of office is how you get it. Story 42. This only works if we all agree that the law is fair and correct. I am sure you can find at least one law you disagree with. I know several I do. I believe we need rehabilitation, not punishment. That means giving people the opportunity to try again in the future. Even if the system is completely fair, I would limit any ban to the period of incarceration. Story 43. Once you have served your punishment, sentence, or reparation, the conviction should not prevent you from serving in a public role. One of the biggest issues in the legal system is that once you are convicted, it is often very hard to start life over again. Story 44. It sounds good on paper, but look right now at how justice is being doled out by a felon. The Department of Justice and the Supreme Court of the United States are approving it. Story 45. I would be against it. There are many laws I disagree with and think it is morally right to break. For example, this law would make Martin Luther King Jr. ineligible for office. Story 46. I think it depends on the crime. A convicted rapist should absolutely be disqualified. If someone jaywalked, was caught with marijuana, drank alcohol while under 21, or committed other fairly minor offenses, then no. Story 47. Such a law would lead to many bogus convictions and prosecutions of their opponents to keep them from getting elected. Story 48. Keep in mind that in the United States most criminal cases are decided by individual states rather than by the federal government. In most cases a state, not the federal government, determines that someone is a felon, which gives each state the power to disqualify a candidate. Story 49. Such a law would have disqualified Nelson Mandela from holding office in South Africa and would likely have disqualified many activists. It might also have disqualified Bernie Sanders, who as a young man probably would have been arrested and convicted for fighting on behalf of minority communities. Story 50. You would think that a country with a relatively well-educated voter base would not allow such things anyway. Story 51. Yes. It is worth a try. Make it so it expires in 8 years and must be renewed. Story 52. I am conflicted. On one hand, I do not want felons holding office. On the other hand, this will disproportionately and unfairly affect people of color because of deliberately targeted programs like the war on drugs. That policy was essentially an excuse by the racist Reagan administration to turn a generation of people of color into felons while ignoring the same crimes when white people committed them. Story 53. If someone has served their sentence, banning them from office does not accomplish much. It removes a right after they have paid their debt to society, and a rule forcing officials to resign after a conviction would be easy to exploit. In many places, politicians already influence police and prosecutors, making politically motivated convictions easy to manufacture. Story 54. Democracy is predicated on the will of the people. I do not like establishing loopholes to subvert that. They would certainly be abused to target dissent. If the people genuinely want a convicted criminal to represent them, so be it. Story 55. I do not support it. Black and brown people are disproportionately charged with felonies while their white counterparts are often charged with lesser offenses. This creates an additional barrier to entry for people with prior convictions. John Oliver's most recent episode of Last Week Tonight explores this in more detail and is worth watching. I support laws that bar people who participated in treason, insurrection, sexual assault and abuse, domestic abuse, or racially motivated crimes from holding office, but I oppose a blanket ban on all felony convictions. Story 56. Laws change. Sodomy was once a felony. Having an abortion was once a felony and is again illegal in some places. Using marijuana was once illegal. Conversely, raping one's wife was not considered a crime in the past. I would not make blanket rules like this. Perhaps an exception should be made for treason. Story 57. There is already a clause in there. They just do not care. Story 58. I am all for it, but the Supreme Court of the United States has already declared that the president is above the law. Story 59. I would prefer to make voting an inalienable right, regardless of a person's incarceration history or status. Story 60. You mean like just about every country that isn't America? I would consider it normal. Here it's fucking bizarre that a convicted felon and rapist can infest the White House. Story 61. Absolutely not. The whole point of the justice system is rehabilitation. You do the crime, you do the time, then you are a free person. Who will know more about what reforms the prison system needs than someone who has been through it? Why would you intentionally exclude potentially good lawmakers and politicians because they made mistakes in their past? Consider the potential weaponization of the system. What will you do when being transgender or gay is treated as a crime? That may be rescinded by the next party in power, but by then many progressives will no longer be eligible to be elected because they have been convicted of crimes. You attended a protest and are arrested as part of a left-wing terrorist group. Now ineligible. Story 62. It depends on what they were convicted of. I would not agree that any conviction should bar someone from office. Story 63. One felony is enough to keep most companies from hiring someone, let alone 34. If Walmart will not hire a convicted felon, why should the country? Story 64. It sounds good until your opponent passes a law that targets members of your party, making it difficult, if not impossible, for you to win and stop them. Story 65. Do you think you could get a constitutional amendment passed for that? You are feeding people who insist the other side would abuse this while ignoring the cases where their side already has. Story 66. We get the government we elect. Anyone can be elected, so be careful whom you vote for. If a felon cannot be elected, convict your rival of a felony. Story 67. The idea is that you can pay for your crime. If authorities sew the word convict onto your clothes when you are released, you create a caste system, and the one we have is bad enough. Story 68. 4 felonies, absolutely. But good luck getting Congress to pass this or the felon in the White House to ever sign off on it. Story 69. I like the idea of preventing convicted people from standing in elections and forcing them to quit if convicted, but I would insist on narrow, well-defined crimes and a fast, transparent appeals process to avoid politicized convictions. Story 70. Convicted of what exactly? This is a broad question. There are many minor, victimless offenses as well as major offenses. Because there is no specific line to be drawn, we cannot rule people out and must give everyone an equal opportunity. However, awareness of serious offenses should be enough to deter people from voting for such individuals. Story 71. I think that's an excellent law, one which I stupidly assumed existed before this nonsense happened. Story 72. Iffy. It's a very easy way for the establishment to suppress up-and-coming rivals. Story 73. I think it would run into some pretty obvious constitutional problems if you tried to apply it to the presidency. Story 74. Sounds fair. To be honest, you should not be running the show if you broke the law. Story 75. A problem I have is malicious prosecution, in which individuals are convicted of offenses that are rarely prosecuted, simply to remove them from politics so they will not challenge the establishment or rock the boat. For example, a political candidate might be given a criminal conviction for a minor parking violation that an average person would not be convicted for. Story 76. That depends on the conviction. If someone was arrested for possessing marijuana 15 years ago, I could not possibly care less. But if someone is a murderer, rapist, or has committed a similar violent crime, they should obviously be prevented from holding a high position. However, the law would be far too easy to abuse. If you dislike someone who has no significant convictions, you could criminalize something they are doing, convict them, and then remove them as a problem. Story 77. What a coincidence. Everyone running against me was arrested. Story 78. It heavily depends on the nature of the convictions. I do not care if a politician is convicted of speeding. I do care if they are convicted of fraud. Story 79. Absolutely not. If that were the case, whoever is in power could simply convict their opposition on baseless charges and thereby prevent them from running against those in power. Anyone who is an adult and a citizen should be allowed to run for any office they wish. It might cause problems, but it is what democracy demands. Story 80. If we followed the current constitution, Trump would not have been eligible. Apparently, insurrectionists are not supposed to run. Story 81. Imagine being convicted and still keeping your job. Teachers, nurses, and pilots cannot. Why are politicians the exception? Story 82. This sounds like how Zelensky got rid of his political opponents. Story 83. There are so many things you are automatically disqualified from if you are a felon. I believe holding public office should be included as well. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.